Well, as everybody is signing on, we are 126 and climbing. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. I am Kim Wong Haggerts. I'm the Director of Engagement and Alumni Initiatives at the School of Architecture. And I want to welcome everybody and thank you for taking time out of your afternoons to join us for the lecture that we have all been waiting for. Professor Peter Waldman will be giving our 5th lecture of our A School faculty lecture series, and we are thrilled to have him. I know many of you have asked about being in Peter's class again, and now is your opportunity. A little bit of rules for the webinar. Peter's talk will be roughly an hour, bringing us to about 6 o'clock, and then we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes for questions and discussion. So as you have questions or things you want to talk about, put it into the Q&A feature, which is on the bottom of your screen, or you can put it in the chat, but we will be going through the Q&A for the questions. The chat will be better for just reaching out to everybody. And sharing thoughts and whatnot. So as the questions come to you, put them in the Q&A, and then I will circle back at 6 o'clock when the lecture is over and read the questions to Peter, and we will all be able to have a great conversation. So with that, I turn it over to Peter Waldman, the one and only, and thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for being here. It's amazing. 145 people apparently are participating, and that's about the number I get in 153 Campbell Hall for Architecture 101. So it seems like the right kind of congregational group to have to hear. 148, if it goes above 153, that room won't take it anymore. But in any event, I think this is titled, or when I did it, Peter Waldman, something like former architect and now storyteller or something like that, and talking about the 2 books of which I've been working on, which is the result of my teaching here since 1992. I think it's about 28 years now, which I suddenly realized is much longer than the other 3 universities combined. I was at Princeton for 11 years, starting in '69. University of Cincinnati for 11 months, and Rice University for 11 years. It seems when 11 comes up, I'm about to shift around, but I'm delighted to say I've done 11 and 11 and plus whatever it is, 28 years and still going here. So it's a delight to share some things with you. I've heard from some of you who said that you might be signing in, and the names are thrilling to me. I'd like to tell you about the organization of this very briefly. It will be heavy on visuals since I encourage the use of one's imagination. There will be a certain degree of complexity of them in that they're overlapping things that certainly by each one by themselves have nothing to do with one another until you begin to force yourself on making some connective tissues. Much of this I have learned from teaching at the University of Virginia, which for me, School of Architecture, which is thrilling beyond the other good schools I've been at, because it's a great school in my mind because it has 4 departments and the faculty and students speak to one another, and that's unique, particularly landscape architecture and architecture, but we are in dialogue. And certainly architectural history, which I should mention for me, comes probably before anything else, even though in our kind of somewhat dismissive time, we don't necessarily look on the past as something to bother with because we're in a brave new world. One of my favorite phrases comes from Sanford Quinter. He used to teach at Harvard, and I believe he's at Pratt now. But in the African Genesis, he says, what could be more modern than the archaic? And so a lot of my teaching has to do with the memory of things in the distant past, but find them profoundly important in the present, in the architectural education as a way to live in the world. So what I'd like to do in terms of the organization of this, since last Saturday, the undergraduates asked me if I would do their faculty graduation speech. It's a way of marking a time of change for them. We've certainly had 7-8 weeks of a remarkable dislocation here, but re-engagement at the same time by doing everything on Zoom. So I'm going to read that briefly. It's 5 minutes or less through that. I will then go on to the images, the first of which you see here, the front book panel, I guess, of I should say that this is all about, as much as it's dislocation and lessons from the lawn in the book Connective Tissues, which is 10 essays by graduate students who were Keenan Fellows here from 2001 to 2016. I'll go all through those visuals and those kind of messages on that, on through there. But it's also about, I think, collaboration. I've been realizing for a long time. I very often write in first person singular, like I. I'll be speaking with some first person singular, I suppose now. And then I often refer to myself in the third person singular, like he, or pretend I'm in Jefferson's mind. But the real bottom line that I've learned from UVA is to be part of a school, and the word we is more important than any of that. And so it's all about collaboration. And I may be naming many, many, many of you that I have known, I think, from UVA first as students at Princeton, 1976. I think Gary Knobloch was the first one who not only was my student, but actually worked on a number of projects with me when my office was an office of 2 people. But Tom Bishops and many others that I knew both as students there and working with me in my practice, to the students that I have encountered here at UVA since 1992. All of my work, the bottom line is it's collaborative. Even these books, I realize, are extraordinarily collaborative. It's not the work of one person. So let me begin, if I can. 175, you're crowding out Campbell 153. Okay, I'm a terrible speaker, but I've been lecturing for 51 years. But I've written out something, and forgive me as I'm looking on down, and we'll be reading something briefly. It's the graduation commencement. I think it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Zoom. It was a very sunny day then. Now it's gray and rainy and cool, actually, like maybe Seattle. But I began this way: good afternoon. What do we mean by these 2 or 3 words in that order? Is good good enough? Is a time frame signifying that the youth of the day has passed us by? Is noon a pivotal moment? And are we on the backside of that equation? Sounds pessimistic to me. Up to now, linear thinking has assured us graduation seems to be the time of measuring past achievements and now focusing onto firmly focused aspirations. We all have shared 7 weeks in limbo, isolated, but also bound by the immediacy of Zoom face-to-face. I used to take pride that I teach the beginning and the end of architectural education, from lessons of the lawn, Architecture 101, onto engaging many of you in the 3rd year New York City studios, a homecoming for me, which delights me in recent years, and recently collaborating in our thesis studios, 4th year theses, with those whom I know, who I now know well as both familiar citizens and heretofore total strangers. I'm a lucky soul to have these opportunities to see you grow better and better again and again each year. I take pride in revealing the hidden foundations of building as a verb together with surveyors and nomads as I later tried to reveal the magic of higher grounds, some call the celestial soffit. I've learned that phrase from Michael Graves. This additional view of a lunatic is limitless as well as accountable with our rooted human capacity to grasp it with Fermitas, a sense of gravity of here and now in this moment. I have asked you all on this first day, I have asked you all on the first day of my classes 2 questions. Where do you come from, and where do you now find yourselves? I have asked myself these questions daily for the past 76 years and find it fruitful to use the architecture of connective tissues as an orientation device to the world wherever I find myself. Rebecca Solnit in A Field Guide to Getting Lost, a book I give to my Architecture 101 students, has told us to embrace the phrase, the blue of distance, to seek out fearlessly the unknown, and to develop a sense of gravity through pathological optimism. I got that phrase from Ardeen Isla Berman, I thank her for it. Some call the curiosity of our hearts and souls. On my graduation day in 1967, before most of you were born, I had won a Fulbright to study in Rome, only to be disqualified the following week by my draft board as unnecessary for my professional education. I was permitted, however, to go to Peru as a Peace Corps volunteer architect. All my self-fulfilled Princeton classmates warned me I would be losing 2 years of my life in the deep, dark jungles of Peru, like Paddington Bear, I guess, away from the center of the world, clearly demarked for them by the latitude of the East Coast in Rome. I would be abandoned, they said, to an edge somewhere down there, below the equator. They said I would be lost and misaligned, off the radar. However, I was sent to the altiplano city of Arequipa, an elevated colonial city 8,000 feet above sea level, but also overlooking the Pacific nearby. I was in heaven, Shangri-La, surrounded by 3 snow-capped yet active volcanoes. The names were Misty, Chichani, and Pichu Pichu. I had stumbled upon a future of life-altering reorientations for which I had never been prepared by my academic so-called curriculum vitae. In this terra incognita, off the beaten path of Ivy League maps, I learned to say yes, like Ulysses Macaulay in the human comedy, to all things and began to liberate my mindset for the better. I have received endless emails over the past 2 years, all signed off by Best. And as I responded the same, short of my usual best wishes. No one now values the utility of wishing in the second millennium of heretofore total fulfillment until COVID-19, I guess. I could have referenced good, like the all too easy phrase for childish gratification, good job. But lately I remembered another line from my childhood, good, better, best. Never let it rest until the good is better and the better is best. Better shows growth, as my students ask me what kind of grade they're getting, and I said, you're growing. Better shows growth, how appropriate for this moment in our lives. This rhyme was a requisite gifted offering of my father, who had high expectations. I now wish us all a better future, one which President Ryan reminds us is ours to shape. This intentional wish is a signal of growth and reorientation, yet unimaginable for us as the future sight of the blue of distance commencing from this moment on this better afternoon. This is a moment for nourishing better, that future optimism, along with your families, parents, and especially enduring and generous grandparents. We, the faculty, send our love and genuine unabashed wishes for your betterment this afternoon. That goes, I'm sure, from all of us to all of you as alumni. We're all more than a family, I think. I should say now, in terms of collaboration, and the first image you see, it's one of 2 books. This one came out in the spring of 2019. When it came out, I think in January or February, Amazon said it was the fastest selling new release in architecture. Anyway, that was short-lived. But in any event, I should say in terms of collaboration, and I don't know if Uni is here, but I had a fantastic graduate student. I never had her in studio, but who worked with me in the book. Her work was amazing. Uni Dan, she was from Macau, a former Portuguese colony in China. She was literate in so many languages. She spoke English and corrected my English. She spoke English far better than I. She worked with me intensely along with my Kenyan students, etc., on this first book. Digitally, I was at the time incapable of most things, and she was quite the trooper working with me. The second book, which I'm finishing now, going to be published, I guess, in a month or so, my major collaborator was Andre Soria, who is tireless and so smart and patient with me. They're all very patient with me. So I'm going to name many collaborators, but Dan from Macau is now working in New York City, and Andres Soria, who has just graduated from our undergraduate and graduate program, is about to work in DC. They are major collaborators on these two books. Okay. The idea behind the books, and you'll see it shortly, and this is the cover. This is called Lessons from the Lawn. My course is called Lessons of the Lawn, I guess because we're here. But when my publisher, who is in Novato near San Francisco, California, said, oh, it must be from the lawn. I don't think he feels the attachment that we have here. And then I said, well, I really would prefer these other words because no one's really interested in the academical village anymore. And I seem too provincial, so other public publishers had told me nice ideas, but no one will ever buy a book on Jefferson's project. It's 19th century. So I said, let's call it The Word Made Flesh. I thought that'd be sexy. And then I really like the idea of dialogues between citizens and strangers. So this is the mock-up of that cover. It's slightly different over there. But the important thing is, and apologize, but not really, that it is somewhat autobiographic and highly personal, which is the way I teach. I teach the singularity of students, and I try to teach it that singularity is not weird or unique, but actually it has the basis of humanity that runs across all of us. So it has Caravaggio's Narcissus, this fellow, which I've often showed in my lectures, in his youth on the top, with land and water, and an image below, which I always thought was a direct reflection, but it's actually a portrait of somebody 20 years older, and it's Caravaggio, the artist himself, or perhaps the young person getting older. Top of it, in given that figure, this nomadic reflection, I suppose, is the Jefferson plan of the library room, the dome room in the rotunda, with those series of columns on the inside in pairs, as if they're about to mate and become a great forest beyond it. And on top of it is a section done by Sam Beal, an undergraduate here, and then a graduate student who's extraordinary and worked with me on the Eric Goodwin project. So I'm superimposing Jefferson's drawing, and I'd say my drawing, but it's really Sam Beal's drawing of the Eric Goodwin Pavilion under construction, which is a key thing through here. This was an early mock-up of that. I'm going to go on then, good. And in terms of structure, I'm not gonna go through all this stuff. I realized that I got into architecture because I did stage sets as a kid and through high school, because my mother's family was married into a major New York director, and all my cousins could act, sing, and dance, and I was clearly from the age of 5 not much of a speaker, not much of a dancer, I suppose. But my Aunt Carol gave me a paintbrush and said, Peter is the cousin who's the artist, which I think was a fake. But in any event, I've been around theater and doing stage sets and lighting for years, and I got into architecture by constructing sets and the illusions of scrims and all that, and lighting, which is so important to me. But there were always actors who had lines. And for me, though I realize this now, I've been teaching from the point of view of a surveyor, which makes the architect very rational and engineer, and it lays out things that are countable. A nomad that looks for the circumstantial oases of things that are like a figure against the gridded lines of a surveyor or a compass or a straight edge. And a lunatic, which makes all my students smile, but I actually mean the one who sees the magic in the night and the logic of the 28 phases of the moon going through there. And we design by day from sunrise to sunset. But I think we should also design with at least 2 centimeters of gold leaf, the reflective magical light of night. So this is just saying that there's a group of terms, and what happens of the collages, the 28 plates, okay, which I'll go into now, of here. And this is the first plate. It's one of 28. I had about 5 or 6 done, I think, when our new dean, Isla Berman, came in. And as one of the senior faculty members by age, she said, Peter, what are you working on? I said, I'm working on this book for 16 years. It's called Lessons of the Lawn. And I made some collages. This wasn't one of them, but it's an early beginning as I build up to the complexity. She said, well, how many will you have? And I said, I had no, I was about to say I had no idea, but I actually said 28. She said, why 28? And I said, because there are 28 phases of the moon and it goes through that. Well, I produced them anyway, more and more. I got to 28. Went out to see my editor in California, and Redondo Beach was the meeting place. And he said, Peter, you've got colored illustrations, but the book doesn't have any color. I said, well, I thought that'd be too expensive. He said, we make great books. This is oral editions. He said, you can have any color you want. I said, well, can I color the 28 pages going from white to intense yellows, like the green, the yellow cheese of the moon, and then back again as it's going from the bleached out condition of a new moon and crescent moons, etc., through that. So it begins with white, and it shows very simply here, introducing the characters of the surveyors, various projects which then begin to come and consolidate together. There's the clarity of this drawing by Justin Walton, together with Sam Beal, worked on the Eric Goodwin Memorial, which we set up a kind of an armature of that grid, which you can see a scalp got removed. And there's a black square, 16 feet by 16 feet of black concrete, like a blackboard, facing to the east. And there's a yellowish reddish square, smaller 12 by 12, facing to the west with the setting of the sun there. And the two outdoor classroom is an image of a great installation by Sandra Iliescu, who is a Princeton student of mine, actually, who's been teaching here since the year 2000 at least. Amazing. She does lessons of making, and I do lessons of the lawn. And below there is a great section by that I worked on when I first got to Rice as an addition to the Contemporary Arts Museum. And actually, Victoria Rixey was a graduate student there, and Doug Rixey, her husband, who I taught at UVA in the spring of 1980 when I was still at Princeton, was there. And to make a long story short, we did a 1 week charrette and got well featured, but it has a basement grotto. It has a rooftop garden with a great crane for reconstructing a museum, and a very anonymous boarded space called the museum in between. On the right-hand side is very simply, and I'm not going to go to the mold, but the drawing tools were used, and a drawing on the lower right-hand side by Rob Coarser, who I hope is here, who's teaching and tenured now wonderfully so, having taught at Syracuse and Kansas and Seattle and Washington University, or University of Washington in Seattle in any event. And it is a drawing he did of the composite drawing of Parcel X, which he worked with, having had him as a great student in '93. He was kind enough to tolerate me, and we worked for 2 years back and forth on this little house in North Garden, Virginia, which is constructed now, and we've lived in now for 25 years. And it's a beautiful drawing, very much like the tools that Jefferson used above, of an orthogonal system and some toroidal systems and some oblique systems that reorient ourselves to the world. So very quickly, I'm going to go through these down here. This is the second page with various increments of influences on Jefferson through there, and Christopher Columbus's map of the going to the New World, and the geometries that he used there, together with the geometries that we used in Rob Coarser drawing below. And then it goes on. This is the name of the Lunatic, a sexual drawing through poplar forest, the big black drawing over there by Paul Golis, who has an essay in connective tissues, and a kind of a view of these issues, again, of poplar forest there together, superimposed on the image of the great house in Indiana, the Middle House and Garden through there. And these are the ideas. I present ideas separately to the students. I want them to begin to overlap on them and see the recurrent ideas through it. These are my favorite cast of characters over here, which is Jefferson, but also Chief Eagle Feathers Bear Claws, two American heroes and different sensibilities to the ground. the tools they used in Phases of the Moon. That's the Eric Goodwin pavilion over there. It goes on to Guernica and Caravaggio and the Trojan Horse, and Phil Bauman, who is a great Rice University graduate student of mine and worked with me 2 years. He worked on many variations of what is now Parcel X, and this is the one we ended up with coming on the right-hand side, coming to Charlottesville, which shows a 3-story kind of architect-inspired house with a few good windows and outdoor spaces, etc., overlaid on Narcissus and Echo through there. And I'm going to move on to preconditions of the site, both at the scale of the School of Athens, which mixes of antiquity with the Renaissance through there. It's a very modern painting and mixes time of the past and present, like James Joyce's multiple temporal and geographical stream of consciousness, as well as the Eric Goodwin image of down here. And it's getting creamier as it goes on. Tom Bishop, so lucky, came from UVA with a superb education as an undergraduate to the graduate school at Princeton in the late 1970s. He then worked with me on many projects, including this very complex a project for first really elaborate whole house that I did outside of Princeton in 1979, 1980, and a beautiful drawing of a kind of axonometric view of the court and the building and the resulting landscapes. Going on to, these are issues of site that were important. On the lower right-hand corner, this is a survey. It's a step-by-step series of models, these little pieces from measuring an existing site in Princeton, New Jersey. It's for a wonderful family called the Fine family that had 3 children in the course of design and construction over there, and digging footings and setting up foundation walls and then framing, etc., for both the floor as well as for the roof and the figural pieces that enter into it all. And here I'm trying to say that the School of Athens and the layout, the centrality of the Maverick plan, and maybe even these projects of finding centers and edges and what is wild and what is contained all run through. And then others, as we're getting increasingly on plate 8, I guess it is, of the highlight of Parcel X that Todd Ray and Rob Coarser literally built out of metal angles up on the roof, having done the first computer drawing that ever touched my work, and tried to figure how we could go from a 3-foot ellipse skylight on the top to an 8-foot diameter below. Anyway, it has to the first image that I probably show you, and I was shown in 1961, September 10th, I think it was, my first class at Princeton, when William Fay Showman III, who had graduated from UVA in 1944 from Savannah, Georgia, showed us this the first day. And I keep on showing it to my students on this because I learned from my teachers, as I suppose we all do. He showed us this image and he said, why is this architecture? And we stumbled around and he finally said, it's an equilateral, it's a pyramid, it's an equilateral triangle. Every side is the same, every angle is 60 degrees. Even the base, you don't really see it as 4 lines, but they're exactly the length of the equilateral slope pieces. And we said, yes, sir. And then I raised my hand and I made a big mistake in my life. I said, what's that in the foreground, sir? And he said, Mr. Waldman, that's not a good question. It's not architecture. And I said, yes, sir. And then next week he showed us the Acropolis, and he showed us an image with the Parthenon boldly there. And we knew the answer because he said, why is this architecture? We all said, Mr. Showman, sir, it is architecture because it is accountable. 8 columns across the front, 16 across the side. He said, that's right. And then I raised my hat and I made my second mistake. And I said, Mr. Showman, sir, what's that building kind of in the foreground? it was the Eric theorem. He said, don't worry about it, it's not architecture. But at that point, I decided that maybe architecture is both the accountable as well as the speculative. So I keep on showing what Mr. Showman said was architecture and my questions. The image on the right has a lot to do with digging into the ground, quarrying from materials, and perhaps harvesting wood from forests, which is what Jefferson did when he made bricks in Madison Bowl and burnt them into in kilns for the 2,800,000 bricks that made the lawn. And he cut trees down from Observatory Hill, and he got the lumber and the water for the rest of the frame construction. It goes on, it gets even yellower as time goes on. My favorite, this is an image borrowed from Michael Grace, and I think it was in '69 when I began teaching with him. And he said, I'll lend it to you on a Tuesday, but return it to the slide box, and I never did. It's a Megaron. It is a combination of two structural systems, both cave-like walls and open frames. When I began teaching there in '69, and by '73, we were entering into postmodernism with '75. And we were told that it was a mistake to use frames anymore, that we need to make rooms rather than space. And so we only build with, well, the 90s is a mistake to use frames, and it's a great mistake. And now we need to build rooms rather than space. And so we only build with thickened walls. But I was resistive or maybe dumb or didn't want to be current at the time. And I said, there's something positive about you building with both an architectural closure and an architecture of more open porch-like conditions. And then it goes on here more intensely creamy as we get to 11 over here. And I superimposed Bilbao and the Tempietto by Vermonte and the section of what you'll see even more of the grotto building in the ground of Houston, Texas, the Parasol House, which again I worked with Doug Rixey and Victoria, as well as with Chris Gennick, who was a Rice student of mine. When I first came there, was an idea of transforming a Cape Cod house, which is a northern house type, into a climatic house for hot, humid Houston, where that house disappeared, and I made the house into a garden. I made the garden into a house. And going on here, I get very busy superimposing everything, all my favorite buildings, Patsy Chapel, the Rotunda under reconstruction recently with all the scaffolding around it, and the Villa Savoie, together with a Times Square competition. Chris Gennick and I won in 1984. First competition I ever entered. We argued a lot. He was a former student of mine, but we wrote two narratives and all about a construction site. And it was all in black and white. And by that time, in 1983, 84, everybody was doing pastel colors. I guess it stood out in the room. So this is a fragment of that down here. And we go on to plate 13, almost halfway through, more intensely trees like Let the Moon over there. And it's the house in Princeton for the Fine family, was published in GA Architecture as a house for a surveyor, nomad, and lunatic. I began to get very precise at the time about building materials, was not interested in form as much as form resulting from the modular dimensions of materials as they come without cutting anything away. And it's a great side of a very student of mine did this very beautiful drawing of a packing crate through which he made everything in Houston and drove up in a U-Haul and unpacked and made all these articulated figural kind of pieces running on through. And then here on this plate 14, which is halfway through, it's like a full moon in this case, is the plan, again, that Rob did of the parcel X over there, superimposed on Alto's Villa Maria, onto images of the Limbourg Brothers and Vermeer, outside and inside, all together. Michael Benedict at the University of Texas at Austin, who's a great friend and collaborator in terms of complexity, he said, Peter, you've gone one layer too much on this. No one will ever get it. That's why I'll show you in the piece down into incremental pieces. You have one image, you add a second image, then you add the two of them together, the composite, you add another image, a third one, a fourth one together, you put that on top of it. And so I try to show that ideas are not irrational as well. The complexity comes from a step-by-step process, like building a building or building an idea. Very quickly now, this is that house for outside of Princeton that Tom Bishop worked on, and Andrew Bartow, whose daddy was the dean of the medical school at UVA, but went on to, the son went on to Bennington and then to Princeton. And I had the two of them together with another wonderful person named John Maruchek working with me in a converted garage in a house we had on Battle Road in Princeton. Anyway, it was the superimposition I never realized of the academical village, its centers and its edges and its meters and its windows on that. And on here, one is David's painting of the Rape of the Sabines. It's really not such a negative thing if you think that out of the mingling of the tribes on the seven hills of Rome, the Latin race was born, the Roman sense of citizenship, together with Lewis and Clark and my favorite chief, Eagle Feathers Bear Claws over there, and the adolescent Athena from Athena Nike, etc. through there. Superimposed all on the Harvard Gate competition I did again with Victoria and Doug Rixey when they were in Houston. It was a very fertile year and it was wonderful to work with UVA people. This is way back in '83, long before I came here in '92. So I have long connections with all the projects I do with everybody else. This goes on to I give the students comparative site plans of the academical village and the Acropolis and even Bilbao and things like that. The Bilbao on your lower right, together with the Pantheon, and their issues of center and dislocated center, or their issues if you flip around the rotunda on top of the propylaea. We view at UVA out to the Lewis and Clark expedition, Louisiana Purchase in Athens. They view out to the Aegean and the rising sun over there. So this is all what the lessons of the lawn are about. Again, these three plans by Rob Coarser. I'm stressing it because it was wonderful to come with somebody who was an engineer first and an architect second. He knew about steel, and we made Nancy wanted a house that would burn, not wood. So we had a steel and concrete house, lots of metal. And it's the plan of the surveyor on the bottom, the plan of the compass with these central pieces. Sorry, I keep on pressing the wrong one. And then the composite plan about the plan of the surveyor. I did these separate plans for each of the building trades. If I show them all together, they'd scratch their heads. I said, don't worry about it. Just give me these 4 feet on center, bar joists, etc. I had the plan of the compass done by students because they could establish their own local oases, and then all the plans get put together over there. Okay. On the Bill Marsh was here in the year 2000 for about hopefully 10 years. It was a wonderful time. He is an architectural historian, an architect, and a landscape architect. He also understands the city at the regional scale. I superimposed. We both loved inaugural stories of how you begin construction sites, or how you begin a city, or maybe how you begin a little memorial to Eric Goodwin between the rising and the setting of the sun. Anyway, superimposed this Grant Wood painting of leadership of an explorer scout and a George Washington on top of with the burning Washington, D.C. in the distance, on top of Bill Marsh's diagrams, which we'll see more of, Reverend Weems, and it's getting lighter now. This is one of my favorite ones. W.G. Clark, I gave him a book, Lessons from the Lawn, a year or so ago. He came back about 4 days later and he said, Waldman, I never knew you had a sense of humor. I said, thanks a lot, W.G. He said he loved this one. It was around Thanksgiving time, I think it was. I take a Grant Wood Thanksgiving image over here. If you count the heads, there are 5 on either side, 5 on either side, well, including the grandpa and grandma. The rotunda, which is back here in the Maverick plan, is the turkey, and on top of it is the parasol, not, no, it's a hurricane house in Houston, Texas, a model superimposed plans below, which I did with Lucy Holmes, a student from Princeton first, and then on with Chris Gennick, who is a Rice a student of mine, who we worked productively for about 3 years in the 1980s. That they are getting increasingly complex as one goes through here. This one, I'll go into a little bit on villa, village, and vastness. It is the title image where I'm putting a lot together of Jefferson's villa, his site plan up here. I keep on pressing the wrong thing. Okay. His site plan, the topographic thing, the mica hand that was brought back with Lewis and Clark. I've got a story about mica, and then the Bill Marsh impositions of the academical village and the map of the East Coast of the United States, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Great Lawn, which is like the middle Great Plains with the going on out through there, and a fingerprint in mica over here, together with the plan of the straight edge, the plan of the compass, and the composite plan of them all together. We go on here, a great collage, well, together with the drawings that McGuinn did, a landscape architecture graduate student, on grass. She's amazing. She did, and it's in connective tissues, but it's the overlay of the plan of the lawn, the gardens, which are now these, you could say, oases between it all through there. The idea that the first architectural act is to break the ground with a shovel and a person at that, and a great collage of the seeding of the lawn, which is not natural whatsoever through there. It's an essay by Hannah Barefoot, a wonderful name, Hannah Barefoot, a landscape architect who has studied the ground, the soil, the minerals, the seedings over time, and leaves it as fallow ground, which is maybe a theme which we're going to get to now. This is 23, because this gets into issues of vastness of the American landscape, and that Jefferson opened up with Lewis and Clark, as Louisiana purchased the vastness from one coast to the other, together with his two images on the bottom of the Campidoglio on the right, and the Pantheon, which originally had a colonnaded forecourt as a rectangle in front of it, very much like. And Jefferson, I wouldn't say ripped out, but borrowed these two images from a textbook at William and Mary, and had them around as he was thinking about the measures and the inspiration for the academical village through there. I had fun with the Limbourg Brothers, which are paintings medieval of medieval France for the Duc de Berry, together with Damascene is in there. But when I had worked for Michael Graves, he was published in GA on the cover once, and then he decided to, before Photoshop, I guess it was collage literally, and in his office he had 10 framed images, all with GA, even though only one was published, with his on the cover of it all. But I was referring to something about that, a Lunatic's Reflections, Voices from Without. And then coming in here, it was when I was writing this, and that August 11th and 12th occurred here in Charlottesville, and it was on the news. We don't watch television, but we have radio going 24/7. And they reminded me of these moments of landscapes of aggression of Wernicke, where the urban civic life is threatened through there, of the fire torches below and the glowing lights of the space above. And so I did a series, an essay, the last essay in Lessons of the Lawn was dealing with the extended conditions of the academical village, as landscapes of development with the fire torches over here around the Lee statue and the Jefferson threatened condition, but also singing Amazing Grace. 4 days later on the lawn when the students and faculty and community people came on out, landscapes of threatened conditions through there. And some more images with images of the Miami Overton competition that Chris Gennick and I also did about 1984-85, which is this idea of success of building up a city in slow stages, not all at once, and beginning with the floods from Noah and gardens of orchards and things like that, until you suddenly build deep into the earth and it becomes Overton was known for its jazz clubs within the 1920s, within the ground, hidden away. And so ours involved section through there as well. And then going through here, which is interesting. I'm not going to cover everything, but I'll just cover these plates. Of the 28, the last image over there, where I combined an image of Dante and Aeneas serving as a guide for Dante crossing the river Styx, and who is blind, and the young man that led him around, and these Contemporary Arts Museum project again that I did with Doug and Victoria Rixey when I first came, my first month to Houston, Texas, and Houston was wide open and quite wonderful, and said, "You're new at Rice University. How would you like to enter into a limited competition?" And I said, yes. And we worked 2 weekends on it and made an extraordinary model, which only UVA people can do, and this kind of sectional drawing down there. And I was happy as a clam. What I'm going to do now, because it's 10 to 6, which is fine, I will end at 6, is show you very quickly, so I don't have to read you anything. This is the back cover of Lessons from the Lawn, and it very strategically gets started. On the back cover, I started with the first one, the Jefferson drawing of the dome room in the center, and this one started with but it's really Rob Coarser's drawing of the various centers, I suppose, that a surveyor may lay on out. It goes into the David Death of Marat figure as a counter-figural piece against the surveying exactitudes of the oblique, the circle, and the orthogonal. I come back on it and superimpose the Maverick plan, juxtaposed to my to Rob's drawing of partial X as on the tombstone over there. And then the last thing I do in the name of the Lunatic is multiple exposures of the Skylight that's in partial X up there that Todd Ray and Rob Coarser literally put together right against the bar joists that are in the back of this this image from me over there, partial X right now. So that's one thing, and very quickly, that's the other one, also dealing with these composite pieces. In this one, which became the final image of the cover, actually has the Eric Goodwin Memorial as the Lunatics thing that catches light early in the morning and late in the afternoon. And then it just shows, which is the didactic purpose of it all, as I'm keeping track of time. This is the important thing for me. I love the complexity that architecture can give us at all scales, from the city down to the garden or to one good window. But I also like that it can be actually generated with one logical piece against graph paper of a gridded image of geometries, knowing how to make form simultaneously well of a figure of, this is the surveyor, this is the nomad, and this is the lunatic, the skylight. I add those two together and I get this image. I add these two together, the Maverick plan, which is another surveying kind of thing, having the last word, and I get these two and they come together in that, well, in that last image, which is that one, yeah, which is that one. So here, there, I won't go into it. It's the layout is very simple. I don't know, it's simple. It's got 4 words and poetry, which is evocative for me. I give it to students their first day in class. inaugural text of a number of essays I've been writing in the Journal of Architectural Education since 1981, all the way through when I became chair. Bill McDonald asked me to give a talk in Capitol Hall. So there's Capitalist in Capitol Hall, down to Villa, Village, and Vastness on Monticello, the Academical Village, and Jefferson's Continental Imagination, to these plates which I showed you, to finally Charlottesville at 11 on Landscapes of Aggression, and then lots of acknowledgments. And so I showed you these, which I'm going to end up soon. I've got 4 minutes. What I take pride in is these collection of collages where they're exactly what I'm asking my students to do in their imaginations and writing. I talk about separate things. I ask them to bring them together, as that's brought together. It's not intended to be brought together, but we can build so much on things that exist already. I actually feel strongly we should build upon, particularly orientation and gravity in the world of architecture for the past 5,000 years through here. And then I'm going to get into the end ones. That obviously is Jefferson's world. That, you know, this is the Villa, Jefferson's daddy, who measures mountains as well as waters, rivers. Same thing as Corbusier. I saw on the first day of the diagram of the mountains, the figural mountains of the Alps, and the horizontal line of the Latin Mediterranean world. But in any event, it's all here. And Coarser, the Empire, which you know. And I'm going to end up with 7 images. Here they are. This is from Connective Tissues. If you look at it carefully, you might find that there's a lawn rectangle here, that there's a rotunda over here, a round thing, that there are 5 pavilions, okay, along the sides over here, going down to the ranges. They are made up in Catherine Killian's and Claire Cass-Stevens, made up of the issues, the separate illustrations they used in their essays, but then I made a collage about them in the end. And that's the first one. This is the second one on tools, Jefferson's plow, etc. through there, his measuring sticks through there, and tools and instruments of construction. Construction of the lawn is a construction site anyway. So here, Chandragar is brought in, but you can still see the rotunda. You can still see, hopefully, the lawn through here, and it's on reading Chandragar and the construction of the lawn, and the figures that are in this tree, and like the narcissus with the land and the water, etc. Through there, onto Jim Richardson's and Maria Insky's graduate students' essays. These all connect, what's it called? Keenan fellows anyway, on One Good Window, Please on the left, and on the Pantheon by Jim Richardson on the right. And going on to Danielle Wilkins in Architecture and Architectural History, brilliantly now teaching at Georgia Tech, who did work on John Soane's house and Jefferson's Monticello, superimposed upon one another onto there, and Paul Golis on the right over here, who did Poplar Forest, an amazing project that took me forever to get to. I didn't see it until 2015, I think, and then I was so overwhelmed by it all. One good room through there, and the comparison between the Soane house, the Jefferson Monticello, and the other Jefferson house, which is the Poplar Forest, leading down to the last, which I'll show you of it all. It is Claire Cass-Stevens' extraordinary thesis of Manresa, Spain, where she connected an existing ancient Spanish town to an isolated monastery and made a landscape connective tissue between the two, superimposed upon the lawn. This is a superimposition of a wonderful drawing by a wonderful drawing by some Keenan fellows superimposed on hers, with the section and the plan of St. Peter's and the Baldacchino between the two, and this extraordinary drawing of the lawn laid fallow over here by Hannah Barefoot. That's it. I'm glad I didn't make you suffer through my reading of Villa Village and Vastness. I'm proud of the words, and maybe I'll just I'll read you just the last thing on it because it may whet your appetites, and then we can go to questions. It says the last word. I pause here no longer as a guide, but as testigo, bearing witness as a gerund, as Cochrane did when he was assembling his private collection as a contemplative explorer of American cultural histories. Cochrane in Washington, D.C. dwelt not so far, far away from Mount Alto, where once, not so long ago, an adolescent dreamed of a national imagination through the lens of a mere shard of mica, pivoting as a prism in his fingertips. Jefferson then, it is rumored, impatiently hit the ground to see the high noon sun multiplied in the immensity of dusty red clay particles reflecting heavenly light. That's it. Okay, I'm open for questions and open for questions and answers if this timing is good. Is this timing appropriate?
It is. Thank you, Peter.
Good, good. I usually run over, but I think that's plenty. 179 goals. Okay.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Peter, for that great talk. We have a couple of questions, and you can follow along if you, Peter, open up the Q&A on the bottom. That way you can read some of these questions along.
Okay, open that up. Okay.
With, we can
Third
start
millennium. Yeah, I think we are in the third millennium. I wrote second. That's right. We are on our next set of thousands of years. It's anonymous, but I appreciate that. Yes. Do you want to read them out?
Sure. Yeah. This is from. We'll go through several of them. Peter, in light of your interest in lunar cycles, are you perhaps intrigued by Neolithic temples and monuments with astrological alignments?
Yes, and I got the chance to go in 2010 to Ireland, to Dublin for some conference, and was taken by Matt McDonough Dumbler. I remember his name. I think his mother is from Ireland. He grew up in Michigan and was a graduate student here after in Michigan undergraduate. He met me. I got him one evening. The next day, he took me out to a place called New Grange. Now, Stonehenge, I think, was done in here. My dates may be messed up. About 3000 BC. New Grange in Ireland was an astronomical Neolithic temple that is dedicated actually for the measuring of the sun angle on the winter solstice early in the morning. So it's 500 years at least, maybe even more, older than Stonehenge, which we think is another Neolithic one. In fact, the Eric Goodwin project, I like that question. We wanted to call the 11th Pavilion, because I teach lessons of the lawn, and President Castine, I wanted to impress on President Castine that you could do a design project that didn't look like red brick and white columns, but it may have something to do with the lawn, and as if it would be a 21st century, third millennium project. He said, no, we have 10 pavilions, so that's enough. You have to call it something else. So among ourselves, Sam Beal and Justin Walter, we said it's approximating Stonehenge because we tried to locate where true north was on it all. So that's a wonderful question. I love that. Yes. Oh, there's another question. Well, I'll let you, Kimberly, do you want to read it? I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
I'll actually skip down to the bottom, just switch different people who ask questions. This is from Virginia. She asked, could you speak more on your use of collage as a design tool, as both generative and representational?
Okay, that's great. I think it is. Maybe I've been doing it for a while, but explicitly when I began to write Lessons of the Lawn which I've been writing for 10 years at least and working with my Keenan fellows. I was told to use the slides for my lectures and that would be enough. I'm going to turn something on. Okay, that will stop. Okay. Anyway, hopefully it will disappear. It will stop. Anyway, I was told to use my slides and they were familiar and they're things that everybody knew. And Michael Benedict, who asked me about his book about 4 years ago, I sent him my stuff and he said, that's fine, but your book has no design. I said, what do you mean? He said, everybody knows these things. They have to see it in a new light. I credit Michael. And he said, you have to design the book. And he said, you have to show what you want your students to imagine. And so I began to collage them by these associations or stream of consciousness. But then I said at a certain point, no one's going to get it. They might think Peter's a lunatic or has these kind of intuitive things running around. And I said, no, I always want to start with the surveyor, a line drawing using geometry. Everybody will shake their head and say, that's rational. Then I want to introduce its opposite, like if I've got a field, I'm going to introduce the figure, like figure field. And so going to be a lot of these painting things of fleshy human beings. And so I brought that in. And then the lunatic, I decided I really care a lot about light and I'm going to bring that in. So as a design tool for my own work, because I like getting buildings built, which I haven't done for a while, I have learned to do drawings and as construction strategies for contractors. So I begin with the clarity of the foundations and the meters and the numbers that repeat. May then ask a secondary set of trades, I mean, perhaps to do these bases or these figural kind of special idiosyncratic pieces, but have a lot to do with recentering us, reorienting us. And the last thing is the light comes in magically. I can predict some, but I love Partial X because it's such a simple, dumb box, but the sun does magical things as it appears to me to move around in the sky. So it is a design tool meant to be very pragmatic. It's a way of introducing the components of a construction site, maybe a sequence of that. Start with the rational, start with the measurable. I think William Fay Shellman III, who must have learned that at UVA in 1941 and taught it to me in 1961. So that's a very helpful question for me. It came from 4 or 5 years ago when I began to consolidate this book and made it something more than the sum of a bunch of lectures. Yeah, okay.
Another question from Steve asks, which is your preferred method for creating false perspective? You see that question?
That's it. Say that again, which is, I say.
Your preferred method for creating false perspective.
Interesting, false perspective. As if I lie or make fiction. I like the phrase false perspective because I like in both my teaching and my students, particularly when we do a building, which is always urban in context, okay? Then you have to work and be in dialogue with the facts. But I say when you get into the internal section of a building, which is what an architect invents to connect these things together, you have to come up with something that comes from within. I say that's what your clients pay you for. An idea that unites all these separate things on the inside. And I call that a fiction supplied by the architect to tie together the loose things that are out there in the preconditions of the world. So I take false perspective by saying, in a good sense, maybe creating a sense of unity from something that is not from the immediate assignment of a project. A client, one of my early clients came to me, she said, Peter, we asked you for 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a family room or something like that, but you gave us so much more. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you gave us light, which we never thought about that. So I think an architect supplies the so much more from the internal section of the building. And that's what we try to teach in the 3rd year New York studios to there. So I like that. I should say I'm a 2-dimensional designer. That's why my state sets are always flats or scrims. I rarely draw in perspective. I do thumbnail things, but I rarely build in perspective. I believe that one wall is there and the second one is perpendicular, and the floor is not the same thing. And so I built in joints, very often places for light between these two-dimensional stage sets of what I designed. So I'm not bashful about saying I really don't design in perspective. There are too many loose pieces for me. Okay. You should be my students again, or maybe you are. You ask wonderful questions. Okay.
Here's a question from Tyler. He asks, has the pandemic and the associated isolation changed the way you think about space and aspects of architecture that are important?
That's another very useful question. We've gone through since, I think, March 11th or something like that, 7 weeks of teaching studio, and I did work your thesis online, Zoom, through there. I am among the least capable digital faculty members, but not totally incapable. I was very concerned. It worked out beautifully in that these sessions are recorded, and many parts of it. The students said, very often, Peter, when you come to the studio and give me a crit, which I do every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you give me so many ideas and it goes in, they don't quite say in one ear, out the other, but I didn't get it all. Now, listening to the recording and hearing it again and again, it makes so much more sense. So that advanced. They shared screens and put their PDFs up, and then they sent it to me, and I printed them out and drew, because I didn't know how to annotate at the point, drew on top of it and had such a good time, and scanned them and sent it back to them. So at studio in the afternoon and drew all evening and sent them back along with fictional writing, so or emails, but writing about how it could go. We have a record of all the writing, and they would write to me, and studio was like 7 days a week. It went on and on. So it was actually an amazing teaching opportunity. What do I think about in terms of the pandemic? And that's why I mentioned that thing about being in the Peace Corps in Peru, as if we're told now we're going to lose 2 years of our lives, or 1 year, or whatever it is, or all my students no longer have jobs. They've been withdrawn in New York and other places. And it's like the end of the world. But I went off to the Peace Corps in Peru and found that in the midst of this, you can find such extraordinary conditions you can build upon. Particularly spring began to bud in Virginia, and the most extraordinary thing, with lots of rain but lots of sun. I have never seen nature be so resilient and full of life. So on a personal level, we're working from home, parcel X, but I had planted lots of fruit trees, and lots of trees exist here. I have never been feeling so resilient, and building upon these simple things and being in a house all day and seeing the sun move around, etc. is, so it's affected me that this climate change and sea level rise, but forgive me for being archaic, but I think the world knew about that with Noah's flood. He's very smart. He took 2 of each kind, and he sailed around for a while, and then he landed on Mount Ararat and began the world anew. And so I tend, this phrase that the dean used, pathologically optimistic about herself, I share that, in that, having been in a world of lots of concentration, I look for that which can to begin the world again, but not in amnesia, building very much upon the past. So well, that's good.
We have a question here from Catherine Lee Dorr. She says, Peter, I remember that you planted an asparagus garden at your house back in the early 90s. Your house must also have some sort of patina by now. What are you talking to students about in relation to our constructions changing over time, and not always in ways that we expect or control?
Well, I'm a bit grayer, if not wider, than I was when some of you encountered me in 1992 and 93. There's a book by David Leatherbarrow and Moshe Mastaba called Weathering. It's extremely important that instead of building something that stays forever, that I think the idea of age and time, the temporal dimension, it takes time to build a building. Buildings, and I like the word building, not so much as an object, as a gerund over there. So I take very seriously, and Lee, you offered me an asparagus patch Uh, uh, and I should have cultivated it better. I just was saying to my Nancy that, because we eat asparagus a lot, you know, if I planted these things way back 25 years ago, it would have an extraordinary patch. Viremia, I think, is the name of your homestead, but weathering is important. Small fruit trees that grow and bear fruit. I say that I'm not a Virginian, but I've been here longer than any other place in my life. And I eat my peaches and my figs and my cherries and my pears. And I have more red clay from North Garden in my bloodstream than most of my 18-year-old students in Architecture 101. So I believe that weathering and processing and being engaged with the time dimension is extremely important.
A question from here. It says Peter, I think it's from Naven, but I think that might be a last name. As an educator myself, your mention of the students with whom you have worked over many years is encouraging. My question to you is, what role does collaboration play in your work? Is there a parallel between this and the concept of collage itself?
Yes. From the start, I guess, Michael Graves was a teacher of mine, and as an undergraduate, graduate student, and a few of us would go to his office and work with him as if it was like on the same advancing of these issues at school. And then I worked for Michael after I came back from the Peace Corps in Peru for about 3 years. It was a one-man office. And Michael always did the initial sketches and let me turn it into a hard line and explode the axonometrics, etc. I guess he trusted me, but I always felt it was, in a humble way, our work, but I was always his student. I finally no longer taught with him in the same courses, but on my own, and developed my own practice. And the first student that I employed after he graduated was Gary Knobloch, who's a UV undergraduate. And we worked on 3 projects that got built in rapid succession. And I've always felt that the way I am with students in a studio, I say I'm not a critic. I come to you as an architect and we'll talk, see what your intentions are, and I will try to help you advance it by suggesting structure and circulation and materials, etc. And we work on the projects together. I don't know if that's, I hopefully they never get dependent upon me. I'm very selfish as a teacher, and I am selfish coming on in and saying, Scott Bernard, so many wonderful people that I've worked with over time and Todd Stovall and Matthew Roberts. I could go on and I could say this I had in mind, and then I go up and teach in a studio, and then I come back to the office and I see what they've done, which is not what I had intended, but further the discussion. And I learned that from Michael. He said, it's in the air, we begin a conversation, but he did not have the whole idea fixed. He said, keep your, as an architect, and as a thinker, maybe keep your canvas wet. He was an oil painter, and so was I. And you don't let the oil paint freeze up. So I keep it wet. I think collaboration is not just an architect's job. You have to collaborate with the builder. You have to collaborate with the users. You have to collaborate with time that puts wrinkles on our faces and bleaches our hair white or something like that. So I think it's an ethical condition that collaging is taking things that were not meant to be together. I never thought, growing up in Manhattan, that I'd live most of my life in North Garden, Virginia, or in Virginia. But those are the surprises that keep perhaps one well with the world. I've worked with design and health studios at UVA. It's an extraordinary thing. You can have cancer and be very sick, but you can be well in the world when you wake up and you see the sunrise on a wall or whatever it would be through there. So I think being well with the world means that you have to be well with that which you encounter, and time is part of it all.
We have a question here from Slinker. Slink, the landscapes in which we've lived stay with us. However, I believe you also design for each site. When starting something new, how do you balance your personal creative narrative with what this site would like to do?
I've learned a lot coming specifically to UVA because of the discussions that Beth Meyer and Julie Bargman and others have, and Harry Porter, who's the dean that hired me. I came here because there's ways that, for example, at Princeton, at least in the 1960s, when I was a student in the 70s, we were taught formally how to make extraordinary objects sitting on the ground. The ground was of no interest. In fact, it might be called dirty. That's why many of my early projects were up on pilotis. It was the object that was there, that was the intention. In Houston, Texas, I learned in that city, which is flat, and the only landscape I could see are the cumulus clouds that came in every day, or the extraordinarily red sunsets that was polluted from the refineries. I saw that there was a landscape not like the trees I knew on the East Coast, etc., or the mighty rivers of the Hudson where I grew up, or the landscapes of Central Park, but actually I had to invent one. And that's why I did the Hurricane House, so it's climatic. So what's the point? I look very closely. Beth Meyer has taught me that their job at least, is to reveal that which is already there, geologically, topographically, archaeologically, cultural landscapes. I now, if you read about parcel, etc., my first project was a 3-story object tower to sit on the ground as an observer and to be seen as one drove by as this exquisite architectural object. My house is one horizontal line, one box. Actually, it's kind of a purplish brown copper front now that hides itself as just a straight line against the topography of the ground and against the verticality of the plane trees there. So I try in a very simple way to leave a few simple marks where marks like framing or a grid against which I can appreciate the richness of geological and archaeological time through there. So that's another, this is fun doing this. This is another, makes me a better teacher. I'm glad it's being recorded. Maybe questions and answers are better when you teach than just delivering a lecture. But I think it's profoundly different since I came to UVA specifically because the living role of history and of landscape, and certainly the urban planning, the idea of the city is the goal of all our efforts anyway, particularly, which is interesting. We're riding out this plague out in the country, like the people in Florence rode out the Black Plague in the Decameron and in nature and in the villa. So I'm not clear about the primacy of cities. I think cities, but they also sometimes Jefferson would say where illness can be spread. And I've been happy in a certain humble way by being out and taking time to look at the changing nature of sight. Okay, SIGHT as well as obviously SITE. So I like that question too.
I think we might come across one of our last questions just to be mindful of everybody's time. And this one is from Thomas Woltz. It says, the response may be different for the Surveyor, the Nomad, and the Lunatic, but in your mind, do all the axis mundi of the many works of architecture gather in a knot at the center of the earth, or do they each root and anchor themselves individually?
Wonderful question from Thomas. He also is an architectural historian, landscape architect. He builds cities and he's an architect. Good question. Beware of knots. It's like planting a garden, perhaps. I'd plant a surveyor with his or her roots and a nomad with their own species, etc., and lunatic one way or the other. I believe an architect, I tell the students, has to have the sensibilities of all three. An architect is a good thing to be because we put together things that others can't imagine being together, but I would not want to hybridize them, which is an interesting kind of phrase of a surveyor, nomad, and lunatic, to say that maybe we are these different beings, empathetic to client and to sighted, but maybe multiple. So I like James Joyce and the Stream of Consciousness, or some of these things or Jefferson, who is a farmer and a concerned with the polis, the idea of the city or this nation, Arcadian nation. So I hesitate on not, because I appreciate that the idea of rootedness, that key word for me, the ground and the depth of the ground, it's just not the surface. That's why I tell my students they're obliged to do not only the program, but also extend it deep into the ground, into a basement or grotto, as well as up in the air, a celestial soffit, or an attic that begins to frame the larger world. We can ground ourselves there, but I'd also say we have to have a cosmic appetite. I don't know, make our hair stand on edge, but somehow be illuminated by photosynthesis, the forces of the sun and the moon that give us light from above as well as light from below. So I love the word rooted, but I also say that my brain or head of imagination be humbled by the vastness of the sky. Thank you, Thomas.
You gave to us this evening, Peter. If there's anything else you want to close on, otherwise we had a packed Zoom webinar, and I thank all of the alumni and friends and parents who joined us today. Anything else you want to say, Peter?
Except when I saw some of the names, etc., through there, you should know that, I don't know, we have found ourselves here for a short period of time or longer, but it is a great gift when I was remembering how important collaboration is, which is a connection on this, and the rootedness that one could have by being out here, even though supposedly I grew up in New York City. And I'm glad I've had both that beginning and extending my end, at least for some time here. So I think it's a great thing that Kim and Isla and others are doing in keeping us in contact with the alumni somehow a little bit closer than the infrequent times of reunions and stuff like that. So one day things will get better, and I would invite you to come out and visit our weathered house and our weathered garden, resilient garden, and I thank you all.
Thank you so much, Peter. You should definitely read some of these chats, and
I will.
I know people are writing to you. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful Wednesday. And next Wednesday will be Matthew Joel talking about the Arctic Design Group. So thank you again, Peter. This was lovely.
Thank you.